Exactly 1 week ago today, 6 bloggers and 3 freelance journalists were arrested in Ethiopia. They call themselves Zone 9. The name was derived from the section of Kaliti prison where journalists are held, which is called Zone 8. According to the bloggers, Zone 9 represents the invisible prison that surrounds all the citizens of Ethiopia who may be arrested at any time for exercising their right to free expression. Ethiopia operates one of the most sophisticated internet monitoring and filtering systems in the world, and these arrests are the latest example of impunity in the country. Journalists Iskinder Nega and Riyad Alemu continue to suffer in prison for their free expression on lengthy sentences. The motto of the Zone 9 bloggers is simple: we blog because we care. They blogged in the face of government harassment, threats, surveillance, and intimidation, and they filled the silence created by the government's ongoing crackdowns on free speech and dissent. Today, we say that we write because we care. Journalism, writing, and blogging are not crimes. We call upon the government of Ethiopia to release all 17 journalists and bloggers imprisoned in the country. And we urge President Obama and the US government to support human rights and free expression in Ethiopia. Now, we will call out the names of the bloggers who were arrested on Friday. Zelalam Kibret.
Natnali Feleke.
Mahalet Fantahun.
Atnaf Berhane.
Abel Wabella.
Bethekadu Hailu.
Tesfalem Waldias.
Idom Kasaye.
Asmama Halegorgis. Thank you.
I'm going to read a bit from the story that won the Caine Prize. It's called Miracle. Our heads move simultaneously, and we smile at the tall, svelte man who strides purposefully down the aisle to the pulpit. Once there, he raises both of his hands, then lowers them slightly. He raises his chin and says, "Let us pray." Dear Father, we come to you today on the occasion of this revival, and we ask that you bless us abundantly, we who have made it to America, because we know we are here for a reason. We ask for your blessings because we are not here alone. Each of us represents dozens, sometimes hundreds of people back home. So many lives depend on us, Lord, and the burden on our shoulders is great. Jesus, bless this service and bless us. We ask that we will not be the same people at the end of the service as we were at the beginning. All this we ask of you, our dear Savior. Amen. The pastor sits, and someone bolts from the front row to the piano and begins to play. The music we hear is familiar and at the same time new. The band leader punches up a pre-programmed beat on the cheap electric piano and plays a few Nigerian gospel songs to get us in the mood for revival. We sing along, though we have to wait a few moments at the beginning of each song to figure out what he's playing. We sing joyful songs to the Lord, then songs of redemption, and then we sing songs of hope. Hope that tomorrow will be better than today. Hope that one day soon, our lives will begin to resemble the dreams that brought us to America. The tinny Nigerian gospel music ends when the pastor stands and he prays over us again. He prays so long and so hard that we feel the weight of his words pressing down on us. His prayer is so insistent, so sincere, that his words emerge from the dark chrysalis of his mouth as bright, fluttering prophecies. In our hearts, we stop asking if and begin wondering when our deeply held wishes will come true. After his sweating and shaking and cajoling, he shouts another amen, a word that now seems defiant, not pleading. We echo his defiance as loudly as we can, and when we open our eyes, we see him pointing to the back of the church. Our eyes follow the line of his finger, and we see the short old man hunched over in the back, 2 men on either side of him. Many of us have seen him before in this very space. We've seen the old man perform miracles that were previously only possible in the pages of our Bibles. We've seen him command the infirm to be well, the crippled to walk, the poor to become wealthy. Even those of us who are new, who know nothing of him, can sense the power emanating from him. We have come from all over North Texas to see him. Some of us have come from Oklahoma, some of us from Arkansas, a few of us from Louisiana, and a couple from New Mexico. We own his books, his tapes, his holy water, his anointing oil. We know that he is an instrument of God's will, and we have come because we need miracles. We need jobs. We need good grades. We need green cards. We need American passports. We need our parents to understand that we are Americans. We need our children to understand they are Nigerians. We need new kidneys, new lungs, new limbs, new hearts. We need to forget the harsh rigidity of our lives, to remember why we believe, to be beloved, and to hope. We need miracles. Thank you.
I guess does this work? Yes, it works. I'll read from my collection, Happiness Like Water. I will read my story, a little section from the story America. That evening, I was hunched over sweeping my apartment with a broom made from the raw and dry stems of palm leaves, tied together at the thick end with a bamboo string. Gloria must have come in through the back door of the flat, through the kitchen, and into the parlor. I was about to collect the dirt into the dustpan when she entered. She brought with her a cake, a small one with white icing and spirals of silver and gold. On top of it was a white striped candle. She set it on the coffee table in the parlor and carefully lit the wick. I set the broom and dustpan down, straightened up. Gloria reached out to tuck strands of my tattered hair back into place. I'd barely blown out the flame when she dipped her finger into the cake's icing, took a taste of it. Then she dipped her finger into the icing again, held the clump out to me. "Take," she said, almost in a whisper, smiling her shyest sort of smile. Just then, the phone began to ring, a soft, buzzing sound. We heard the ring, but neither of us turned to answer because even as it was ringing, I was kissing the icing off Gloria's finger. By the time the ringing was done, I was kissing it off her lips. Mama still reminds me every once in a while that there are penalties in Nigeria for that sort of thing. And of course, she is right. I've read of them in the newspapers and I've heard of them on the news. Still, sometimes I want to ask her to explain to me what she means by that sort of thing, as if it is something so terrible that it does not deserve a name, as if it is so unclean that it cannot be termed love. But then I remember that evening and I cringe because, of course, I know she can explain. She's seen it with her eyes. That evening, the phone rings, and if I had answered, it would have been Mama on the line. But instead, I remain with Gloria, allowing her to trace her fingers across my brows, allowing her to trace my lips with her own. My heart thumps in my chest, and I feel the thumping of her heart. She runs her fingers down my belly, lifting my blouse slightly, hardly a lift at all, and then her hand is traveling lower. I'll skip that part. Suddenly, Mama is calling my name, calling it loudly, so that I have to look up to see if I'm not just hearing things. We have made our way to the sofa, and from there, I see Mama shaking her head, telling me that the wind has blown and the bottom of the fowl has been exposed. Mama stands where she is for just a moment longer, all the while she is staring at me with a somber look in her eyes. "So, this is why you won't take a husband?" she asks. It is an interesting thought, but not one that I'd ever really considered. Left to myself, I would have said that I'd just not found the right man. But it's not that it's ever been something I'd particularly been interested in. A woman and a woman cannot bear children, Mama says. That is not the way it works. As she stomps out of the room, she says again, the wind has blown and the bottom of the fowl has been exposed.
This piece is set in Cape Town, a small town just outside Cape Town, South Africa. Thursday Malicious had worked at Abalone Silver for 2 years. It was the largest abalone farm in the Southern Hemisphere, covering 10 hectares, with kilometers of epoxy tanks teeming with the mollusk. The long administrative buildings were made from prefabricated aluminum siding. When Thursday clocked in at 8, a fog layer nursed Hermanus Bay, and whales could be heard snorting and breaching in the distant waves in the springtime. Thursday used to work as a clam shucker in one of the government fish factories, but got fired after negotiations with the employee union went south. So he simply walked down the street to Abalone Silver, and they hired him as an abalone cleaner. The main difference between the creatures was that a clam had 2 sides to its shell, and an abalone only had 1, and was more of a glorified snail that fetched hundreds of dollars in East Asia. When the abalone were happy, they slid along on tiny eggplant-colored tentacles, which they would retract when afraid. He sometimes imagined a battle between the abalone and clams of the world. The clams might be better at slicing the abalone with their shells, but the abalone were faster and could suck out the clam with their large feet and then cut it up with their teeth. He thought about this battle more than you might think. Although he tried to remain objective, he would play favorites and manipulate the battle conditions in his mind so that the abalone, surviving in a narrow latitude around the world, compared to clams, which flourished in rivers and streams, could come out victorious. Abalone functioned better in the darkness, so he gave them that, and abalone liked fresh kelp, so he put that there too in the battles of his imagination. The work at the abalone farm was more stressful than at the fish factory. The bosses were looking to turn a profit rather than provide a government service to society, so the lunch breaks were short. And no one brought any brandy. And the job was messier. The seawater got piped in and the mollusks lived for years, so the tanks had to be regularly cleaned and scrubbed, whereas the clams at the fish factory had been killed on the spot. Thursday was charged with trimming the slimy green foot from the 70-millimeter adult abalone for export to China. He was good with a knife and could get through about 4 in a minute, but when the seawater grew too warm or the pumps clogged, worms would wiggle in and eat the shells. And they were a nuisance because the abalone would outgrow the half-eaten shells and taste acidic. For 2 months every year, baby anemones would squeeze through the filters and then mature in the tank. They would squirt their seeds into his eyes and cause them to swell up, making it hard for him to get a date. He didn't cut his fingers much because of his clamming skills. Thursday was a steady, reliable worker. He didn't put in overtime, but he punched in on time and didn't sneak off early. He acknowledged his mistakes and was amenable to criticism. After 18 months at Abalone Silver, he'd been promoted twice, with a 2 rand per hour increase each time. He also managed to pocket a few shells and buff them into an opalescent polish for the whale watching season to sell to tourists, but he was discreet about it. Discreet that was, until Brother Leon showed up while Thursday was counting the big adults on an abacus. "Awe, how's it, Thursday?" Brother Leon asked. Brother Leon considered fish factories and abalone farms beneath him. Leon was good-looking, cinnamon-skinned, affable, persuasive, skilled at domineering, and wore a hat all day. Not a sailor's snook cap, like his father, but a red-brimmed baseball cap that covered a beautiful head of dark-curled locks. Thursday was balding and wiry, and the squat Malay nose had never been bred out of him. His deep brown eyes were lozenge-shaped, with the left one half closed in a squint. Brother Leon considered fish factories and abalone farms beneath him. Being a mate, Leon liked to remind him of all of these things. Leon also had a bigger penis. "How'd you get in here?" Thursday asked. "I snuck in through the gate." "Get out of here, you'll get me in trouble." Brother Leon had a way of completely ignoring what you said and making you think you were having a conversation. "Give me a few of those pearlies, will you, Thursday?" Thursday declined. I just need 10. No, say a few tens. 70. No ways, my brew. We count in every day. I got a promotion coming. Leon raised his red cap off his head and his locks spilled onto his forehead. This was a trick he used with the women. Get 'em drunk and then razzle-dazzle with the locks. What's that promotion gonna bring you? An extra rand, brew. That's donkeys. You can make a lot more than an extra rand. I told you 100 times that I won't. I'm not a poacher. They've got that dog, Snoopy. The paper said her nose can smell Perlemon through the water. Feeling righteous, Thursday added, I'm an honest man. Leon looked hurt. 10 is all I need. You that broke? It's terrible. Thursday would not give in to Leon's pleading that easily, not until Leon gave his word to pay it back. Brother Leon was never really down and out. He had a half-dozen girlfriends who would have given him the PIN numbers to their credit cards just to catch a glimpse of his pretty face. 3 of them, Jackie, Fadanaz, and Tembisa, left their windows unlocked at night in the hope that he would sneak in, he said. Thursday decided to bring Brother Leon a bag full of some polished shells over the weekend and even bought him some chips, but didn't listen to his pleas. Then he returned to work at the abalone farm thinking he was as right as rain. Trimming and counting, cleaning and slicing, Thursday enjoyed the gentle way of the abalone.
So, and then I thought we'd start by asking Chinelo, her thoughts around about Nigeria. Nigeria is in the news not just because they're going into space, but because they're banning homosexuality. And then in no particular order, we can just talk about homosexuality and its politics in Africa. Chinelo.
Well, that's a big topic to talk about, but like you said, this year, January, Good Luck Jonathan signed the bill, the anti-gay bill that has now resulted in more persecution for the LGBTQ community in Nigeria. And, I think it was shortly before that it went viral, a couple of, Lagos College of Education girls or women who were stripped of their clothes and beaten publicly, and people, videotaped the whole thing. So it is, a problem, which many Nigerians, Nigeria being, at least in 2012, according to a Win Gallup poll, that Nigeria was the second most religious country in the world. So being very religious, saying, homosexuality is banned by the Bible, and also that homosexuality is a Western disease, basically. I think that we just need a new conversation around that topic because, like this cartoon says, well, the Bible, is also, maybe not quite an African concept, so we just need to broaden our definitions of all these categories that we make up, and that could lead me into a different discussion on, categorization. But I should say that I'm happy that this discussion is not, are you an African writer? Because that's another category.
That creates chaos.
But anyway, so those are my thoughts just to start us off.
Any other?
I think this is probably apparent in what I read, and it will be apparent in what when my book comes out. I'm particularly obsessed with the idea of Christianity in Nigeria, and I think it's something, because I've been influenced by it. My parents are incredibly Pentecostal people, and I grew up in this situation in which we were praying constantly. Every time, we left the house, we were saying, in the name of Jesus, this and that. There was one time my father was convinced that we were going off this sort of straight and narrow. I think I brought home a B+, and he was convinced it was because I was exposed to bad elements in society, and so he made us watch nothing but a Christian network for the entire year called Trinity Broadcasting Network. And so that became, I had shows on that network I liked just because it was the only thing I could watch. All that to say that, my family has been Christian for all of 2 generations, basically. My grandfather converted in Nigeria when the British came, and then my father obviously took it on. And I think that sometimes I understand the importance of religion. I understand the importance of spirituality very much. I would consider myself a very spiritual person. But at the same time, I do think there needs to be an interrogation of why it is people have accepted wholesale a system that was forced on them, which isn't to say that you shouldn't follow Christ and look to Christ as somebody who's a powerful figure, who inspires, and who perhaps even lives within you, as a Christian would say. I accept all of that. But at the same time, I do think that there needs to be a questioning of the way that the system, that the Christian system, if you will, has imposed a kind of, I don't want to use the word that comes to mind is a kind of oppressive, in some ways, an oppressive system that says you have to do things this way, you have to think this way, you have to walk this way, you have to talk this way. Because I think there's something about people feeling inferior that's associated with that system. In other words, when I had a conversation with my dad about Christianity, this is the cause of a major argument between him and I when I was a teenager. I had just read Things Fall Apart by Achebe. I was feeling particularly militant on that particular day. And I said, well, we've been Christian for all of, 2 generations. And what about the fact that we're Christian because somebody came and said that we have to be Christian? What about that? And I could see that I had inspired something. He was angry about that, and we had a back and forth about it. But I do think that he said something that I found really interesting, which is that before the Europeans came, we were struggling, and they had all these wonderful things, and the reason they have these wonderful things is because of Christ. And I think that's the germ of the problem, the sense that some Nigerians may have, absolutely not all, but some Nigerians may have, that the reason why Europe is doing well is because of Christ, and so that if we follow Europe and we follow Christ, then we'll do better, we'll do well as well. And I think that once people begin to think that you're kind of, the inferiority becomes a core part of the way they see the world, and that needs to be challenged on any front.
I think the case in Nigeria is probably a more recent one, but we have seen that in Kenya and Uganda happening and other parts of Africa. But one also has to understand, how this debate is framed, especially when it comes to African governments and how they want to go about it. I did this drawing a while ago, and it is a debate when they argue that way. It is because they would rally the masses. That is one. And second is that they would always use that to divert what's going on. In Uganda, for example, you've had also, an anti-gay bill that was passed recently. And there has been a lot of things going on in Uganda. The president was very unpopular. His base was, working to, there were all sort of stories that, his party, does not want him anymore. And so when it comes to the anti-gay, it is one of those things that, the power that be would always use to stay in power, to stay popular, and to basically to divert attention to what's going on, around the country. And so one has also to understand the context into which sometimes this issue is introduced in many African countries.
Yeah, and I have the cartoon up now. You can see this is Museveni giving all sorts of, he's saying, hey, all these crises that are happening, and then he comes up with a law that he will pass to rile up the masses.
It is not actually also, it is not a joke actually. The president actually set up a committee of scientists actually to probe the link between, actually to probe the genesis of gayism, as he calls it. And so I just probably, stretch the argument and the joke by saying, look, I want to, to probe the link between mosquito and gays, because, we have issues like malaria still, harassing the continent seriously. And for the president to come and say, look, we want actually to fight, to spend taxpayers' money to investigate the origin of the gene of the gay gene, it is, I don't know how ridiculous it can get. So you can see that how that will take attention from actually very serious issues that are affecting the continent.
Yeah, just to piggyback on that, that's exactly what's going on in Nigeria right now, because Jonathan, good luck, Jonathan, is up for re-election. And so at this moment, before he passed the anti-gay bill, he was not very popular. This is a president who has mistresses, spending, money, airplane rides on, Stella, all of that. So to divert that, focus, he has now figured out a way to, rally the Nigerian population, again, like 98%, not Christian, 98% religious, and clearly very homophobic. So now he's figured out a method to get them on his side, and that's exactly what he's done. So it's exactly what Gado was saying.
I could throw a little twist into this conversation. What we're talking about is using the issue of LGBT communities as a distraction for politics. In my book, originally, actually, I had two characters, a gay couple, who raised one of the main characters. And what happened was I had to cut that storyline. And I say it's a twist because this is a distraction from the real politics and the real issues in the countries that we've been talking about. And in my story, it was unfortunately a distraction from the plot. It's kind of a thriller, and it was actually a story I spent a lot of time on. I spent probably more time on that chapter than any other chapter. And I had to cut it because it just slowed things down. And I guess, I'm just talking to bring it back to the issue of literature is, you're making decisions every day about what you can include, what makes the story work, what doesn't make the story work, what political issues you want to address, and but you would have no way of knowing that in this story. And I even changed the characters' parents, and you wouldn't know. So anyway.
Let me ask you, Gado, did you get a different reaction to these cartoons than in other equally political cartoons?
Normally, whenever
can you hear
sorry. Now, with this particular one, you have a small percentage of people who would write, hate mails or accuse me of all sorts of things. But it's part of the destruction, because they would not argue any case, and they would just, I must say that personally I'm very insulated, and most of the time my editors actually receive the first line of defense, and they face a lot of this. And I'm aware for the fact that religious groups, Muslims and Christians, are always on Daily Nation's case whenever I run cartoons that support gay community, or whenever I attack them. I mean, for sure, I think the cartoon about the Bible being an African, there was quite a strong reaction from the Roman Catholic. I am raised as I'm quasi-Catholic. I was baptized as a Lutheran, brought up as a Catholic, but I'm not a practicing Christian. But over the years that I have attacked religious groups in my work, I've received quite some very strong reactions from them.
I wanted to add that amongst the Kikuyu, where I grew up, actually 3 houses down, there was a woman married to a woman, right? Because amongst the Kikuyu, traditionally they sanctioned woman-to-woman marriages. Now they did not sanction man-to-man marriages, and woman-to-woman marriages were along masculine lines, but so essentially you'd have a woman who take on the role of the masculine, and so on and so forth. But the marriages were there, which makes me wonder, and maybe we can talk a little bit about this. Is there, I don't know, it might be an unfair question, but is there a sort of, are there homegrown answers, right? Amongst my people, I would say, well, yeah, I mean, why can't we work with the institution that's already there and develop it, and so on and so forth?
historically, we Nigerians have that. We have what's called a woman marriage, which, was really just a business transaction, which marriage historically in the Western world was also a business transaction. And so, that's possible, a way of reframing it and saying, well, marriage is beyond just marriage. The question of, love. In Nigeria, where we did that, I think it was, well, my culture anyway, the Igbos, women marriage was, if, for example, also if a woman could not bear children, then she could marry another woman who could then, continue her family line. It's actually more complex than that and very complicated, but that did exist.
All right, let's switch.
Yeah, I think also my view is you asked, if there are homegrown solutions to such a discussion. I think one, yes, in many actual African communities, and this is woman to woman, at least is known, and it's quite acceptable. But I think my view is, I just hope that the discussion around the issue of gays and lesbians would be taken a notch higher, because what we've seen over the years is same old, come and say, oh, this is an African, and there's nothing actually, So my argument is, I think this discourse probably to be framed differently, and that might help.
And now the question: are you African writers? But let me frame the question a little bit. When Topi won the Kane Prize, and there was a Kenyan newspaper, right? And the Kenyan newspaper had a big in bold caps: "American wins the Kane Prize for African writing," right? Even though in that same article, Topi had gone on to talk about, he considers himself Nigerian and American. He was born here, and so on and so forth. So there is no way he would have framed himself as that way, just as an American. So there is this contest, it seems to me, around who is an African writer. So.
You invoked my name, so I'll respond. I am perfectly comfortable with the arguments and the discussion around my identity. I think it's fine and it's understandable. I spent most of my life in America, basically all my life in America. I grew up in Utah, and then I went to Texas. I went to school at Morehouse, and then I went abroad for grad school, and I lived abroad for a few years. But for the most part, I've lived in America. And so I think I understand why somebody would see my bio and say, well, this person isn't from Nigeria, isn't from Africa. Actually, the wonderful thing about the Kane Prize is that it gives you this tremendous platform. You have an opportunity to travel to a lot of places. And I was in South Africa in September, and I just given a talk somewhere. And I got off the stage, and I was going somewhere, and somebody came up to me and said, do you know that you took this prize from somebody who was living here in South Africa, who's been writing in obscurity for a long time? You already have every advantage in America, so I just wanted you to think about that when you're sort of traipsing from here to there. And I was so flabbergasted. I was like, wow, do you want it? Here, yeah, no. Let me have it, never mind. No, I was kind of shocked by it, but I did think about it for some time, and I'll say a couple things in response to that. I'd say first that writers around the world are struggling to get recognition, and so I know that when I started writing about 4 years ago, nobody was expecting me to write. People were rejecting my pieces left and right. It wasn't until I got this one piece published and submitted to the Kane Prize that people even sort of thought about my work or read my work or anything like that. So I understand the pain that comes with trying to get your work out there and thinking that you can't get it out there. And secondly, I'd say that I can't help who I am, and there are a lot of people like me, perhaps some of us up here. My parents came to the States to find an opportunity, and they raised us in the States, and And, and we're out here, my siblings and I, everybody who's like me and we're trying to find a space in this world, a space that is in between. Certain people have tried to come up with words to describe this very interesting and diverse and kind of complicated space. One word that comes to mind is Afropolitan, which is something I don't necessarily agree with or subscribe to, but I do think it's an interesting attempt to capture this kind of group of Africans abroad who are coming up with a new definition of themselves. I wonder what my kids, how they will define themselves. I'm sure part of it depends on where I raise them, but I'm sure they'll have the same kind of issue as well. They'll bear my Yoruba last name. I'm half Igbo, half Yoruba, so they'll have that Igbo with them as well. And so I'm sure they'll be accosted for their perspectives as well. But for me, the most important thing is to write. I think the writing takes care of everything else. I've been questioned, when I was growing up, people were saying, you're not an African American because you're not from here, and now people are saying that I'm not an African because, this and that. So I suspect it'll be an ongoing conversation, and I'm very happy to have it.
Yeah, I don't like categories at all. I feel like, even within that, you have something slightly different because you were really almost your whole life in the U.S. But even within the African community, there will be people who will say, well, you're not African enough. Having written my story, even my forthcoming novel that is tentatively entitled Under the Udala Trees, I had someone say to me, well, when was the last time that you ate an Udala fruit? And so they're always going to be, and to be very frank, I could have told him that I have probably eaten one more recently than he had. But what happens is you put people in the position of being defensive, which is really quite petty. There's no reason for that, just because a person does not fit neatly into one category does not necessarily invalidate all the other categories that a person is. And so, I don't know, I just don't feel that I should waste my time trying to answer and prove to people that I am African. Or maybe I'm not. It's also the LGBTQ community. Just, we don't have to be streamlined. It's okay if we're not. We can be everything at once, Yeah.
Sometimes it's funny, though. I went to Nigeria for the first time since I was 1, basically, last November. And one of the funniest moments happened when I got off the plane and I was going through customs, and the person saw my passport, and he said, speak Yoruba to me, speak Yoruba to me. And he was trying to challenge me, right? I was like, I don't speak very well. He said, why are you coming here? Get out. But it was a funny kind of back and forth, he was aggressive, but I know from my parents, that my parents talked to me like that, so he was joking with me as well. And it was kind of an embrace also. He was kind of saying, welcome back in his own kind of rough way. And so I think it's hilarious sometimes when that happens. I mean, part of it is like, reclaim who you are, don't forget about us. And part of it is speak Yoruba to me. So,
It's funny, actually, that I had a similar experience, but not having been born in Nigeria, been born in the U.S. And in the last chapter of my book, in the first chapter of my book, the airport challenges the main character and says he's lost his accent, just that, and that he's been away from the country. And I think that's an issue. Frankly, I was surprised to be invited onto this panel because I often find that I squeeze between these categories. I grew up in New Jersey. I'm very proud of New Jersey, but I don't pretend to have had the same experience as my friends in New Jersey who did not have a Nigerian parent. I'm also mixed race, mixed culture. And I know the people who were visiting our house were different. We had African people. We were the only African family in the town. And that meant that we were having different experiences and paying attention to different things. And I feel committed and passionate about Nigeria and my work. But, in terms of the Kane Prize, and I gave a workshop earlier today about stereotypes of Africans in writing. And I think there are a lot of ways to do it, to fight those stereotypes. And the main one is sort of, recognizing diversity. And that's saying that people have had many different experiences. There are people who were born and raised in Africa, but within those people, there is no uniform person. Everyone's had a different experience. They may have experienced an event together, but they're people like in any other town. You got a spectrum. And I personally would have been fine with the Caine Prize. I am fine. I didn't submit to the Caine Prize for my own personal reasons. I would be fine with the Caine Prize not allowing people who do not live in Africa at that time. I think I have no problem with that. If they want to change the rules and say you have to be living in Africa right now to win this contest, that's fine. But those aren't the rules. And I think they want as broad of community as possible. I've met Lizzie Etry, who runs the Caine Prize, and we've talked about it, and change the rules. New contest. There's the Nigeria Prize now, a $100,000 prize, which is a big prize. That was won last year by the president of Nigerian Penn. So there are other opportunities. I personally, if you want to create the rules and say you got to be living here, I get it. In the same way that if there's a magazine called Ziziva, I think, on the West Coast in California, and you cannot submit and be published in that magazine unless you live west of the Mississippi or something like that, or live in California. And I completely agree with that. That makes sense. So much of literature is New York-based, but that's not the way the Caine Prize works. It's open to people who identify themselves as African.
I have traveled and met, African American writers, and I've met African writers. My view is I think a lot of this discussion is really around issues that are not so important. It's, in my view, I think the discussions should be about content and form rather than personalities. And I think recently we've had also, probably we can stretch that into Kenyan literary pages, where we've had Mukoma's dad being part of the subject that has been going on, that is, Ngugi living abroad and writing from abroad. He's not Kenyan, and so forth and so forth. So I think the discussion, in my view, has lost track, or at least some of it, and I don't think it is necessary, and I don't think it is helpful. And I agree. I think categorization of this kind of categorization, it's actually mostly waste of time.
Let me ask you about Chinua Achebe. Here again is a Gado cartoon. Essentially, God saying he has read Things Fall Apart many times.
Is that a drum?
Yeah, a drum, trumpets. So how's Chinua Achebe? How would you want to talk about him? Has he influenced your work? Do you believe he's the father of African literature? Do you believe he should have written in Igbo? I don't know. like how? Yeah. So Chinua Achebe.
I first read him when I was I think I was in college actually when I first read him. And it was a book that featured prominently in my life because it was the book. My parents don't read a great deal of literature, but we obviously heard about Soyinka and Achebe growing up, in addition to Kuti and King Sunny Ade and those people. So these were people that I constantly heard about. And I wasn't, I think when I was growing up, I didn't read it because I was still in the midst of trying to trying to find my space in America. Again, I was born in America, but my folks are from Nigeria, and it was in the same way that if my parents sort of shouted to me in Yoruba on the playground, I'd be embarrassed by it, when I was growing up. Just kind of this, because there was this sense, anytime you saw an African on TV, he was the bumbling idiot, or he was the idiot who, dressed in rags, or he was the African prince, and sometimes I didn't fit neither of those categories.
Proverbs.
Sorry?
And spoken proverbs.
Exactly, yeah. So I think I was trying to find some space there. And then I went to Morehouse for undergrad, and it was assigned, and I read it. And I think that novel really kind of politicized me in a way, because I started to think about, again, I mentioned before, my parents' Christianity and my Christianity in a different way, because I had always thought about it in a very theoretical way. We're Christians and we speak English, and we, use the English alphabet because of colonization, but to read that book made everything come home to me in a way that it hadn't before. And I think about what a brave story it was, especially for somebody who, he was in his 20s when he wrote it, so it's really kind of a triumph of talent and of will to get that book out there. And I think I also see it as a source of inspiration, because sometimes, and I'm in the midst of completing my own novel, the one thought that comes to mind occasionally is that, and it's tied directly to the identity piece, is that I'm not writing for a particular defined audience. I had this, going back to South Africa, I had this moment when I was fortunate enough to be speaking with Novala Bulawayo, who it had just been announced that she was a finalist for the Booker, and so everybody was excited about her and what she was up to. And at one point we were sitting on stage, and somebody in the audience began to cry because, and we didn't know why she was crying, so somebody brought the mic to this person in the audience, and the person said, well, No Violet has captured my childhood in a way that better than I could have, and this is an incredibly powerful piece of work. And I had this crisis, this kind of artistic crisis at that moment, because I thought, will anybody cry for me? You know, somebody cry for me. And so I went back to my room, trying to write sort of, gripping passages. But the core of that was this idea that because I've been in between my entire life, that I'm essentially writing for people who are in between as well. I'm not sure if there's a kind of large cohort of people out there, at least I wasn't, who kind of can identify with what I'm trying to put out there. And I go back to Achebe because I'm not quite sure if he knew at the time he was writing that anyone cared about his story. And there are so many tales about how he sent it to London. The manuscripts were lost, manuscripts were discovered in odd places, but the story survived. There was something potent about the story that needed to be in the world, and the story itself took on its own life and ensured that it made its way into the minds and hearts of millions of people. And so I think that says something about the potency of stories and of literature. I think the artist is somebody who bears a torch. I think humanity is kind of stumbling forward in darkness, and the artist is the person with the torch who's leading the way and who's able to see a bit farther because of what they've been exposed to, because of what they've been inspired by. So to the extent that I can be a torchbearer as well, I think we're all torchbearers. I think it's incredibly important to continue that good work.
As far as being influenced by him, by Chinua Achebe, I knew his name and watched dramatizations of Things Fall Apart before I even was aware that there was a book written by him. And, my mom loved his work, but really didn't speak to us about a book, just talked to us about, Okonkwo and the rest of them. And so, yes, he's influenced me before I was aware of whatever that influence was anyway. In general, I just think that his writing is just another example of the power of literature, and I feel like it's an important thing, just writing in general, just to be able to get, for example, the LGBTQ community that I'm concerned in writing about. I think what literature gives us is that middle ground where we can talk and have a conversation without it feeling so stringent and no movement, basically, because in the LGBTQ community right now in Nigeria, there is an impasse, basically. The government is not moving, the human rights activists cannot move, there's a standstill. And so I think that, Chinua Achebe must have had something like that going on, and that's why we feel compelled to write, because that space of literature is where we can hold and have these conversations without it feeling too polarized.
How do you deal with literature? Like how in your cartoons, how do you deal with because are there similarities in terms of aesthetics, in terms of I don't even just a general consensus on the politics?
Mostly plagiarizing.
I'm sorry.
Mostly a plagiarize, cartoonists, do that. We love that. You just get a good book and you take a quote and just make it into a drawing. The good thing is nobody can sue you. For me, I think he's one of those writers who kind of opened, my eyes in the way I see things and the way I would comment on things. Just like, for example, to draw your attention to the drawing, we grew up with the images of course, Jesus being white and the angels being white and having white faces. But in all my drawings, for example, whenever I draw Jesus, actually, whether I draw Jesus as black. And so it's always very interesting that, I always get this kind of very mood reaction. You can see even the little angels, that they are different. They are of different origin, so to speak. I mean, I don't have the image of God as a white, guy with a long hair up there. And so what I've done, people like Achebe that helped me, is to see things differently. And that's how I deal with, and that's how I represent that in however controversial that is in my work.
Yeah, I can talk about just briefly, I suppose. For me, and again, I talked about this morning, so I apologize to people who were at that workshop, but Achebe showed me, he broke the mold. I had not seen confident African writing and a strong voice at that time. I read it in high school. My father gave it to me as a gift. And to see that mastery of storytelling and to be really moved by the story was really amazing for me. And I think having role models I mean from the standpoint of craft, actually. Not just the fact that the story is set in Africa, but that the prose fits what the Western, sort of what is expected from a story. So those signals that we're reading in English class, typically American, typically British, he was doing, and then playing with it and playing with injustice. And he captured that sense of frustration, which the other author I was reading at the time was Hemingway, who I think is a master in the art of frustration and voice. He just captures that feeling perfectly. I think it's great for high school because a lot of people are frustrated in high school for different reasons. And I felt that Achebe captured that, but then put the injustice of the story, of the missionary story and cultural change. And so he's definitely an inspiration. But in the same way, Hemingway, I read almost all of his books. I think you have to, as an author, he's a great person, great writer to learn and study, but at a certain point you have to move beyond. He wrote a lot of other books, and he wrote a lot of short stories. So that book, he's known for it, and it was a masterpiece, but same with Hemingway. He wrote a lot of books. Some of his books weren't very good. Some of his stories weren't very good. And it's good as an author, as someone trying to write and create, you need to know that people are flawed. If you hold up Achebe too high, and then you lose your own ability to craft because you can never beat it. But definitely an inspiration for me.
Let me ask you. So, for the generation of Chinua Achebe, even with people like Goge, whether they agree politically, there's one thing they agreed upon, which is that the role of the writer in society is to be political, to agitate, to speak up, and talk to the contradictions of that society, right? But in their generation, if you think of Things Fall Apart, you have Okonkwo, you have, like very Manishian, you have African culture, you have European culture, they're in conflict, right? But for us, we live in a world where things are a little bit more diverse, we're all over the place. In this era of globalization, right? And here is a cartoon from Gado, democracy getting resuscitation from Mediator. But okay, what do you think your role as a writer is in contemporary society? And for you, Gado, as a cartoonist as well.
I think my role is just to create really good stories. I mean, it's funny because I am capable of being very political. I do have very strong political perspectives and beliefs, and I am a person who's capable of writing like a 20,000 word blog post about something I'm concerned about. But I try that's different and separate from my artistic life, which is one that's about craft. It's about creating sentences and really is about serving or following the story and letting the story kind of show me where it wants to be. It's funny, when I used to listen to writers talk like that, I used to like make fun of them because it sounds really esoteric, like, what are you talking about, the stories? But I think it's kind of true, and that's why I can't think of myself as a political writer, because oftentimes when you're trying to craft something, you'll notice that the story needs something, and even if there's a part of you that wants it to go in a very particular direction to speak to something that you're concerned about, the story won't cohere. The story will fall apart, if you will, if you try to do that. So it becomes important that you don't allow that process to overwhelm your sort of creativity. And it's fun. A lot of the writers that I respect a great deal, I'm thinking, for example, of maybe Transtromer or Alice Munro or people like, I mean, these are people who don't write explicitly about political things, but their writing, I think, is very political because it's writing about the human condition. And it's writing that's about the way people interact with each other. Politics starts on the kind of person-to-person level. Why am I jealous of this person? Why do I love this person? Why am I attracted to this person? Why am I repulsed by this person? I think that is the core of any kind of politics, because writ large, that becomes, one nation against another nation and that sort of thing. And so I think the moment that the writer or the artist perhaps sits down and says, well, I'm going to do something that is explicitly political, then perhaps the art is compromised by that. There are obvious exceptions to that. I'm thinking of Guernica by Picasso, which is inspired by, were there any number of wonderful pieces of art that are inspired or are in response to a political situation or war. But I think that even those pieces have to come from a place of creativity and art.
I initially did not think that I was a political writer. I thought I just want to create something beautiful. And so I'm like you in that sense. But now I completely embrace it. I am a political writer. It's not like the UN African writer question. I am, and I think to an extent you can't help but have your writing be political, because what helps me write, what moves me to write, are things that bother me. And so, in as much as I want to create something beautiful, I also want to speak to the controversies and say something important. And, well, for marginalized people, I'd like to give a voice to them. So,
do you mind if I ask when you came to know that you were a political writer? I mean, was there a shift, or
I went
kind of woke up
to
and said,
an interview.
Okay.
I was interviewing for a job in Boston, Massachusetts, for Northwestern, and one of the professors asked me, well, are you a political writer? Something to that. And I thought, no, I'm not. I just write stories. And I realized how foolish that was. That was a very foolish answer. It was not that long ago.
I see potential for controversy.
What's that? But I think that when you're starting out, and my writing career is just so young, like I just really, many times I ask myself, what have I gotten myself into? I don't know how to express certain things, and I haven't fully thought about things, and so when you're pressured to think about it, you realize, oh, this is more than meets the eye. So anyway, I'm political, sure. What I really wanted to do back then was separate my writing from myself, but it's impossible to do that. So you can't say, well, I'm not a political person, I'm just a political writer, which was, something I was trying to say, maybe I can do that, but no. But basically, right now, my main agenda is to carry on that tradition of giving the LGBTQ community in Nigeria a place in Nigeria's literature, as well as other Africans have also done that. But I think that this whole statement that homosexuality is not, that it is un-African, I think it needs to be challenged by reinserting them in the history and the literature of our country and of Africa, the continent, and of the world as a whole.
About 10 years ago, when I was a student at Vancouver Film School studying classical animation, I got into a discussion with a friend, a colleague, and I think at that time I asked him, who's your prime minister? And he threw his hands in the air and said, I don't know. And it was quite shocking, for me as a student then. in African context, everything is political. We don't have the privilege that the West has, that you can stay political. Everything is political, and so it puts you in a position where you just have to be political. Now, as an editorial cartoonist, I think I don't want to overemphasize my role, but I think it's also a very privileged position for many reasons. I think you can always discuss things that probably other people are afraid to discuss, and you have that leeway to do that, even though sometimes that comes at a cost. I mean, to be effective and to do your job very well, I think you have no choice, really. You get yourself into these positions, and just like writers and other disciplines, you get into a situation where you are enraged by what's going on. You feel it. You want to say things. You want to fight. You want, and so it is a position, whereas yes, privileged, but you can always use it to your advantage or to the advantage of the society at large.
Well, I'm kind of a plant because I work for PEN, which is a writers' organization that promotes free expression and literature, and this is the PEN Festival. So for the past few years, I've devoted my life to that aspect. But PEN's great. Go to pen.org if you want to learn more about our work. But I would say I agree that you do have to focus on the craft. And I think I was motivated primarily by seeing conflicts around me, and they were not necessarily political conflicts. Could be on a sports team. Why does that person get to start, and that person is always on the bench, or in the cafeteria? I'm talking about school, of course, But I was starting to write from elementary school all the way middle school, and just. And then having grown up in a family of great storytellers, so knowing that, just being encouraged and inspired to listen and to be able to tell a good story and keep the person entertained. So I do devote, my day job to trying to promote free expression, and it's very rewarding. But in terms of craft, if it's just people would call that a screed or just a political statement, I think people turn off. And what's hard as a writer is, you want the conflict in the story to move it along. One challenge that I have as a writer is depicting a truly racist or bigoted character. And those people do exist in real life. It's hard to really get into that mindset because it's sort of terrifying, and to write those words on the page. I do feel most people have an opportunity for some redemption of some kind, and in the right circumstances could change their minds. But there are some people who are really angry and mean and nasty, and you see that examples of cartoons like this. So that's a challenge, is trying to make people human. But there are in real life real bigots who do terrible, horrible things. So how do you portray that person in a story and keep it realistic?
Yeah, so now this is where it gets tough, because I have all these questions and slides that are prepared just to give you a taste. But we also want to hear from you. But there is one question I wanted to ask, though. So let me ask this, and then I'll hand over the mic to you guys. So there's this whole debate that has emerged, actually, also around the Kane Prize, which is about how writers, and intellectuals are representing Africa to the outside world. A term that was, the term that's being used is either writers are participating in promoting African porn and African poverty porn. Though there would be nothing wrong with promoting, and also, so the idea of a Kane Prize aesthetic that then writers are aspiring to. The whole idea being that writers are representing Africa in in a negative way. And I just wanted, I have my own thoughts on that, but I wanted to get your thoughts as, not utopia since you're not political. For the political, no, I'm joking. Yeah, but your thoughts on that, on representing Africa?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. It's funny, the response to the political question is a very interesting one, and we've spoken about this before, so it's interesting to hear your evolution. I am just interested in art. I'm interested in beauty, and that's the one thing that kind of inspires me. And so I think that will continue to be the case. At least, so with respect to the way that people write for the Kane Prize and that sort of thing, I would say that in the first instance, I didn't think that I was eligible for the Kane Prize when I wrote the story. I wasn't even thinking about the Kane Prize. I was thinking about trying to get chapters together for a novel and sending them out like a crazy person. And so it wasn't until I had published the story that somebody emailed me and said, hey, I really like this story, you should think about getting it in the Kane Prize. And then I thought, whoa, that's something I hadn't even considered before. And then I sent it in, and so all of a sudden it became a Kane Prize story. All of a sudden it became like this critique of religion or something, which it wasn't at all. It was meant to be a story about an immigrant community in the United States that's trying to survive, that's trying to make it, and that's looking to God for solutions in a way. All that said, I think that people have to write, it's a cliche, I know, but I think you write best about what you know in some ways. And so that's why it's not coincidental that a lot of my writing is about immigrants in the United States, because that's what I know fairly well. And if you're growing up in a situation where people are being treated poorly, where there's a lot of poverty around you, I think it makes sense that you would write about that as well. So the question, I think, it really shouldn't be on the writers. It should be about interrogating publishers and what they're putting out there. I think there is this sense that the market wants stories about Africa that are about people coming up from poverty or struggling in some camp somewhere, because we've all been battered, at least in the States, with images of, you know, people with swollen bellies and flies on their faces. So that's one way that people think about Africa. And so I think in confronting and interacting with literature, people are unaccustomed to an Africa that isn't like that. And so I think that all of us writing stories now, whether we're in space or, you know, whatever we're doing, I think that we're kind of constantly pushing the boundaries. That charge, to invoke Novalet's name again, she was called, people said that she was writing poverty porn, and she embraced it and called herself a poverty porn star, which I think is a tremendous label. I love that. But I think if you think about her book, or you think about Taye Selassie, I mean, there's so much African literature out right now. It's crazy. Like, there's so many books by people of our generation, and I think that we're pushing those boundaries. We're challenging what Africa means. We're challenging what it means to be an African American. I think there is this incredible movement that's happening that we haven't quite described yet, that no one's written about in terms of a movement yet, but I think it's happening. And we're in the midst of it. And I think that over the course of the next 5 to 10 years, some really exciting stuff is going to come out that challenges what it means to be, you know, quote unquote African. And again, it's because we're kind of carrying the torch forward. We're showing what Africa is going to be in the 21st century. And it's not going to be the static depiction that, you know, of people, you know, starving and everything else. It's going to be something that's dynamic and raw and new and exciting. It's going to be, I think, about the 21st century. So I think that's more exciting than anything else.
Really quickly, I should say, I don't think it's foolish to say you're not political. But for me, sitting in that room at that moment with all the stories they had read that were really very political, it made me realize. But just to clarify that.
No, it's just
I was speaking for that very specific incident. But anyway, yeah, I think, let's face it, nobody will be happy anyway if you gave them a story where everything was perfect and everybody was happy. People would say, that's boring, or I'm jealous, and why are you writing this? Why are you, like, rubbing it in, whatever, you know? So we do want a little bit of, like, we write because things are not fine, and we write stories. That's kind of inherent in storytelling. Like, something goes wrong, something gets fixed, or something like that, right? And so it's not, there'll be some problem. The porn situation, the fact that, like, we're showing Africa in negative light. Well, American writers showed America in negative light. You know, so many countries have done the same thing. It's not really that serious. That's, I guess, my opinion on it.
We have that every year. Yeah, I think that debate is going to be around for a while. But I would like to phrase that a little bit different. And actually, I would like to argue that actually very little is coming out of Africa. It is just now probably, there is some attention. But actually, very, very little is written about Africa. In fact, I'm always amazed whenever I travel that to me, every time I travel, it's like people are even more ignorant about Africa. Now, that is not to say that, Africa doesn't have its share of negative stuff. I mean, there is plenty of that. But it is just amazing that, as a practitioner, media practitioner working in Africa, it is so little. I don't think we have even scratched the surface of African stories, to be honest. So that's one. The second thing is that what I would like to see, in my view, for most African countries, I think we keep complaining about the Kane Prize, the so-and-so prizes, but I would like to see African prizes. And as I'm getting older, not that I'm old, so I tend to look inward a lot, and I've always looked at what African governments and institutions doing to promote literature in Africa. The answer is very disappointing. And so we keep going around and say, oh, they're not talking about Africa. And I have my own issues with a lot of writers and stuff that has been written about Africa. But I think also it is important that, instead of, for example, a couple of years ago, I think President Museveni bought a jet. Mm-hmm. That amount of money would have done a lot of good if actually, he actually invested it into a literary prize. So we Africans, we need to do more for Africans, for literally writers in Africa. That's what we need to do. And I think that will shift the discussion, and I think, we'll get more results, we'll get more positive results, as opposed to this discussion that has been going on. Not that it's a bad discussion, but I think it's somehow skewed that, and I've been reading this for the last, 10 years, 20 years about, how Africa is portrayed. And I think if that is not corrected, then, we'll just be, going into this wild goose chase of some sort.
I think what's more important to be, with that Africa poverty porn situation is really what, Chinua Achebe did, which is we want to tell our own stories, so we're writing about the topics that matter to us, and they matter to us, so we write them. And if what matters to us is poverty porn, then so be it, but we are telling our own stories, and beyond, any other discussion of why are the streets dirty and why is there a dumpster here, who cares? I'm telling my story, and that is my right.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I would say there are some structural impediments in place that prevent a lot of authors from reaching an audience. I can speak to the MFA program I did in South Africa. There was one South African of color in that program. Even last year, it's now run by someone from one of the, I believe from the Cape colored community. There's all these classifications in South Africa from apartheid, so I don't mean to keep those going, but I believe the program is run by someone from the colored community in South Africa, and there was not a single person of color in that MFA program. And when I spoke to the head of that program at that time, a couple of years ago when I started, I said, well, how do you know? And this is a famous poet who, like many of the well-known South African writers, got their name fighting against apartheid. Said, I know within a paragraph whether someone is capable of being a member of this program. So what does that mean if English is your second or third or fourth language? It means you won't get into that program, and they don't get into that program. So I think there are structural impediments. You can write what you want and write what you know, and the only way to get rid of that is activism. There's a Twitter campaign. I saw 2 campaigns today, just on the way into the office. One was about more diversity in children's textbooks, and the other was about something else along. Just going around today, people are starting to talk about it, but it's a real problem. I mean, for me, the poverty issue when I worked in South Africa, I did work with refugees, the refugee community, as a lawyer, helping refugees from all over the continent in South Africa. They're in the book, but I try not to make them victims. I try to show them as stuck in a system. I would meet doctors, lawyers, people who spoke 4 or 5 languages very well, but couldn't get their certifications, so they're living in shacks in a township. And then, the other characters in the book, the abalone smuggler, you heard about him. And then the rest are a bunch of scientists. Many of them are Nigerian scientists. And then you have South African scientists, and you have, I try to have the whole spectrum. There's people at all levels of society and try to depict that. That one family was refugees and they have to get their permits. I don't think it should be exploited, that story, but, in the book I try to show that there are other things too. So, that's my take on and the responsibility of a writer. I feel like you write what you want and write what moves you. I don't feel like anyone has personal responsibility, but, and that's another conversation. I'll just point that out, actually. Why are African writers expected to talk about social justice issues, but you don't expect that from your typical story American literature? You don't expect that from your typical poem. When you go to a poetry reading in New York at the Bowery Poetry Cafe, they could be talking about their fixie bicycle that they just bought and how it's so beautiful, and that's great, and everyone's happy with that. And you're an African writer, you're supposed to be talking about the big issues. There are all these traps. Why can't you just write about your own fixie bicycle in wherever you live in Africa?
As long as it's an African bicycle, you can.
Let me just say one quick thing. I'm at Cornell, and we have found money for a prize, a Kiswahili prize for African writing, right? So if it works out, it will be the first prize, a big prize that's offering money for writing in African languages. But we need more money. This is why it's at now, right? So if you can think of funding sources and so on and so forth, let me know. But let's get some questions from you guys.
Is the mic coming around? There's mic here. Questions?
Hello, everyone. Hi, guys. I have a question for Mr. Gatto. You mentioned that Africans need to do more to kind of promote our own literature. Any idea what kinds of things do you think that we can do? I'm from Ghana, and our president, John Mahama, even though we have major political problems and the currency is down and all sorts of issues, that's another conversation. He's sort of made a soft commitment to really kind of promote Ghanaian writers and Ghanaian literature abroad. So, that's a start. We have to see where that's going to go. But my question for you is, and all of you also on the panel, what kinds of things? There are lots and lots of talent on the continent, but they're not getting here and they're not being heard. The prizes, I think, are wonderful and a great way to start, but there's so many other stories that are not being heard and voices that are not being. So just kind of wanted your opinion. Thanks.
I think, there are tons of ways to go about that. I personally would like to challenge governments to put more money, for example, into schools. That is the prerogative of the government for certain. Deji talked about, how people can write, for example, in their local languages and so forth. I, as an individual, for example, the last 2 years we have been involved in doing a pilot for the children's show, Once Upon a Time in Africa, and basically it's a show that would tell African stories for to kids. In an entertaining manner. So you have 4 characters that go back and forth in time and talk about, all these great stories that nobody has heard about. And the pilot project is about these 4 characters going back in way into 15th century to rescue the first African library in Timbuktu. When we wrote that story 2 years ago, little did we know that actually the Islamists would attack Timbuktu, and the very same manuscript were being desecrated and attacked and burnt and so forth. The reason we got involved in this project is because I, with my two daughters, 9 and 7, I watch cartoons with them, and there is very little from Africa. And it is not only annoying, but it is terrifying. And so, I talk to them, and yes, I think you would find, folk tales about Lion King and lions and safaris. But Africa is much more than that. It's just so much more than that. And a little research that we've done to develop this project is that they are just, this stuff is not taught in schools. I love history, but I do that out of my own passion. I follow and I read, and I've quite literally learned a lot about African history in my adulthood. So I think it's a challenging question, but I think this has to include institutions, this has to include individuals, and so forth. I don't think for a second that probably it's only probably a 1 year. It has to be structured, and it has to be. It will take some time. But if we are to go anywhere, I think we will have to do a lot much more.
I also think it goes beyond just, creating prizes and all of that. I think that, the prizes are almost the end of it. You reward people who have learned to write and have successfully written, but, we have things here in the U.S., residencies, and outside of the U.S. as well, and I think we need to nurture or even train the people beginning. So, writing schools, writing programs, residencies, all that stuff needs to be increased. And there are lots of men who are in these programs and all of that. So I think I would promote having, versions of Hedgebrook in Nigeria and other parts of Africa as well, just, to keep us all in the game.
Very briefly, that's exactly it. I think prizes are kind of top-down. Somebody is saying, if it's a government-sponsored prize, somebody in government or some sort of supposedly bright panel of people is saying, this is the best writer, this is the best story. And literature there should be a kind of bottom-up element in literature as well. I mean, I think ideally there's some book that's out there that people can't stop reading, that they're really excited about, some African Harry Potter or something that just sweeps the continent. And I think it would be fascinating if there's a book that, has that effect and is also really popular with, the art crowd, some kind of, I think of an album like Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, which is an album that I love, which is a simultaneously sort of great album that anybody can listen to, but that is a masterpiece, a shining work of art. And I think that the reason you can have a piece of art like that is because the people like it and the supposed prize committees like it as well. And I think that's when you have something that's really resonating. It's not somebody saying, look, read the story because it's really important. It's because people can't stop thinking about it. And that, I think, is where we want to go.
Just to add up to what you asked, I think during our research we realized that actually, the Kingdom of Ghana practiced good governance way back in the 13th century, long before we in the media and the non-government organizations made it a cliche. So there is actually a lot that is not known about Africa today. And I think we, in our own small way, I think that's one way we would want to tell these stories.
I'd love to hear your experiences with large commercial international publishers in terms of if you're able to protect the integrity of your stories and get them published as you wrote them, or if you're having to compromise in order to fit the appetite or desire of...
I can speak to that. I do not have a large international publisher, but I do have a very good one called Unnamed Press, which is really, if any of you are writers, I suggest you submit because they're looking for stories from all over the world. I talked about structural impediments. What's tricky with writing is it's an art. So there's a lot of aesthetic judgments, people making judgments on the craft, feeling this wishy-washy stuff. And this happens to a lot of writers, not just writers of color or writers from Africa, and it's an incredibly frustrating process. I have not been asked to change any of my stories for cultural reasons. I've been asked for plot reasons, and I appreciate that. If a character, as a writer, you know when the feedback is constructive. If someone says, I don't get this character, that's not constructive. Well, what don't you get about that character? You don't know their neighborhood? What, does the neighborhood not feel right? Does the street not feel right? It's not enough to say that. And that's a pretty common response to all writers, but especially to writers of color, and that's a conversation. There's a good article in Slate about that recently. So I think there's that problem. It's kind of loose. But I definitely think you have to get the story, as a writer, you write for yourself and your friends and family, and that's extremely rewarding in and of itself, the process of writing. And then at a certain point, you hit a switch and the business side kicks in. And that, if you're not ready to do business, you shouldn't try to become a professional writer, because that's what it is. And it is as fun and exhilarating as professional businesses, and it's as horrible as professional businesses. So I think that aspect, and I would say most students, but especially students, people of color, I've seen some creative projects, like the Afrofuturism project by Yatasha Womack. She's also a filmmaker. You see people who have good websites, good blogs, they're trying to push it. I think at that point, once you get into the business side, people of color, African writers, unless they are often at a disadvantage to get their work out there.
People talk about certain writers trying to write to a certain aesthetic or trying to, for example, we've mentioned the Caine Prize on this panel, this idea that there's a Caine Prize story. I don't think that's quite the way it's happening. I think what happens is that a writer is interested in joining this conversation, this writerly conversation. They go to the bookstore, they buy a lot of books, they read the books, and they sort of subconsciously take on some of the ideas, the aesthetic elements of the books they're reading, and in their own writing, they join that conversation so that the story that they create is in some way similar to the stories they've been reading. That's the way literature has been happening for centuries, right? Like you're jumping into the stream, and your work doesn't become sort of understandable to certain publishers unless you're part of that conversation. That said, I can't speak directly to your question because I'm in the midst of the process myself, and I don't want to offend any publishers out there. Hi, who might be. But all that said, I think I had this really interesting conversation with an agent who called my office 3 weeks ago. I have no idea how she contacted me at my office, during my day job. And she's like, I love your story, it's so amazing, and I'm reading these books by Taye Selassie and Chimamanda Adichie, and I think that I see you doing that. And I got really offended by the conversation because it was apparent to me that she was saying, like, I'm looking for somebody to fill this market slot in my sort of list, and you have black skin, and you have a weird name, so you're doing what they're doing, come on board. That's some BS, man, I'm not trying to do that, but I recognize that, that's part of the way that I'm perceived, I think all of us to a certain extent, the first time someone sees you, they see your name, and it's a human thing to do, you automatically think, okay, who can I compare this person to? And if this person is, so quote unquote an African writer, you instantly think, oh, Chimamanda, she's an African writer. Beyonce likes her, I want somebody to like this guy. So it becomes a part of that conversation. And I think as an artist, you want to step outside of that. I think we're all interested in doing something new. So the terrifying thing is this idea that you want to do something new, but you also want to be a part of that conversation that I referenced before. How can you do both? That's the ongoing struggle for any artist, I think.
Yeah, but let me add a little something, because I was looking at the criticisms around All Violet's book that came out before she announced for the Booker. And almost without exception, all the criticism coming from the New York Times, these are the book reviews, New York Times, Boston Review, and so on and so forth, they would commend the Zimbabwe part. They would say, oh, the Zimbabwe part is so beautiful, it's so real, and then when the character moves to the US, where the character is more critical, talks about the hardships of immigration and so on and so forth, then the reviewers will be like, well, then it starts to lose its luster, it becomes a poorer book. The New York reviewer went as far as to say that since now Violet has done very well, she went to Cornell, went to Stanford, that things can't be that bad, So there's this sort of, I think because of the new literature that's coming now, there's a sort of, I don't know, critics don't know exactly what to do, neither do agents. They don't know what to do with this literature of characters who, in the 60s, the characters who come and go and follow their authors, But this is our characters who are coming and staying with their authors and being critical from the inside, and so on and so forth. But not to hog the mic. Any other questions?
I just wanted to ask, are there publishers in Africa, and are they sending their books here? And there must be. I don't think I've seen any in any bookstores.
I can talk about South Africa, which is where I studied. That Kwela Books has a lot of African writers. One is Kubetli Mwele, who's fantastic, and he's in the US right now. He wrote a book called Room 207, which is really good. I recommend you all read it. And then there are a bunch of smaller presses in South Africa that are published. And it's hard because they try to, they'll publish there and then they try to make a deal with a publisher here to basically license the book. And then they'll sometimes even re-edit it from the original manuscript. And one of the best crime fiction series that I've read is by Mike Nichol, who inspired me to write this book. It's called The Revenge Trilogy, and it may be coming out, but I don't think it is. And it's just because no one wanted to license that book, but it's a very difficult, hard-boiled fiction, but this writing is incredible. It's a great story. And, a bestseller in South Africa is 5,000 copies. So you've got this great book down there, and it may not make it here because no publisher wants to take a risk. People don't know who he is. They have to build up his name and reputation. So you have a challenge of getting those stories out.
Shall we take one more question, unless someone wants to respond to that? One more question, so you can have time to buy our books, so we can sign them. I'm only half joking.
Hi, thanks for the recommendation of the book Room 207. I was just going to ask if everybody could give a recommendation of their fave that maybe we hadn't heard of here.
It becomes a political response, so I have to think about that as well. Go. I need to think of a suitably political response.
Well, I don't even know if the question is of African books or because it came after.
It doesn't have to be African, but that is the panel. I was sort of thinking of books that perhaps have been published in the continent, but we haven't heard of here.
Okay. Well, I'll just say one that just comes to mind right away is, the other gentleman that was shortlisted for 2013 King Prize, Abubakar Ibrahim. His book is a collection of stories, The Whispering Trees. And his publisher, for somebody just asked that, is Parousia. And then, there are other publishing houses in like Cassava Republic, Farafina, in Nigeria as well. So there are quite a bunch of them. Yes.
Oh, yeah, that's a great place to start, actually. Chimurenga, the journal Chimurenga is fantastic. It's put out in South Africa, but they feature writers from around the continent, and some of them are really, it's just an incredible thing. It's like a broadside newspaper. And there's just so much good writing in it. I can't even, it's like overwhelming. Almost every piece is well edited and well written. It's by King Prize winners, by people from up and coming authors, has your work been featured in Chimurenga?
Sort of.
It should be. It should be. But it's great. Yeah. And definitely Chimurenga, yeah, you should check that.
And Kwani as well. I mean, that's another sort of wonderful
Kwani,
place.
exactly.
Transition. I'm partially transitioned because they published my first story. So there are a number of places to find, because what I'm excited about are the emerging voices. And I think there's so many exciting emerging voices out there. Every time I've spoken in front of a crowd, at the end of the conversation, somebody comes up to me and says, inevitably this person's a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, and they always whisper, I'm a writer as well. And so there's so many people, especially I think folks from the continent, right? I know for a fact that that my parents were incredibly hard on me. They ensured that I got a good education, and I couldn't even think about becoming a writer until I had satisfied my parents by getting a scholarship to Oxford. And then once that happened, then I could think about my own life, right? I could stop thinking about placating my parents. And I suspect there are a lot of people in my position who have got the law degree to placate somebody or perhaps themselves, and now there's something inside of them that needs to be expressed. And I think, again, it's about re-articulating what it means to be an African in the 21st century. There's something that's bigger than us that's trying to express itself about what it means to be living at this point in the early 21st century. So I'm incredibly excited about those emerging voices that are coming out.
I would also, like to say that I would recommend this panel. Everybody here, including the moderator. But
that was the political answer.
But yes, also I would recommend Yvonne Ward, Dust. It's a new book that came out. Yvonne Ward. Yeah, Dust. I think it has received quite some previews, in the States.
Yeah, there was a very good review in the New York Times of Dust, actually.
Yeah, great review.
But shall we take just one more question, or shall we call it a day? Democracy. Yeah. In any case, what are we doing after this? There's a reception. Yeah. So there's a reception, so we can continue the debate out there. But let's give the panelists a warm hand of applause.